On the 18th of April 1945, a German staff officer stood at the edge of an open field near the Rhine and tried to count men the way another man might count grains of sand. He gave up. There were simply too many. For as far as the morning mist would allow him to see, grey-green wool stretched in unbroken columns, rifles already stacked in neat pyramids, boots caked in the same mud that had swallowed his army for 18 days. He had expected defeat somewhere on this war's long road. He had not expected this. Not an entire army group, dissolved. Not 200,000 men, then 300,000, then a number so large that the officers doing the counting simply stopped trusting their own tally sheets. 317,000 German soldiers. 24 generals. One entire army group erased from the German order of battle in 18 days, by a force that German intelligence had dismissed less than a year earlier as amateurs playing at war. This was not Stalingrad. Stalingrad took the Red Army 5 months and more than 1 million casualties to force 91,000 starving survivors to lay down their arms. This was faster. It was larger in captured manpower than any single surrender the Wehrmacht suffered anywhere on the Western Front. And it was not the Soviet Union that did it. It was the United States Army, in the smoking industrial heartland of Germany, in a river valley called the Ruhr, and outside a narrow circle of military historians. Almost nobody can tell you its name. To understand how a nation that entered this war late and stumbled badly in its first battles against seasoned German divisions in North Africa, ended up dismantling an entire German army group in barely 2.5 weeks, we have to go back to the spring of 1945, to a Germany that was already broken, but had not yet admitted it. By March of that year, the Rhine, the last great natural barrier protecting the German heartland, had fallen. In the north, the British and Canadian armies under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery crossed in a massive set-piece assault. All bridges and airborne drops, and weeks of preparation. In the south, French and American forces under General Jacob Devers pushed toward the Alps. But it was in the center, at a shattered railway bridge in the town of Remagen, that the war's balance genuinely shifted. American engineers of the First Army found the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, undemolished by a German garrison too exhausted and too confused to finish the job, and they poured across it before anyone in Berlin fully understood what had happened. For 3 days afterward, engineers worked under artillery fire to shore up a structure the German army was still trying, unsuccessfully, to finish destroying. Demolition charges had been set, and one had partially detonated, buckling the deck without severing it, and every hour the bridge stayed upright meant more American armor, more infantry, more fuel rolling into the German interior. A German engineer officer assigned to destroy the crossing later admitted, in a statement taken after his capture, that faulty wiring and a jammed detonator had cost his army the one obstacle that might have bought Berlin another month. It did not matter in the end. On the 17th of March, structurally exhausted after 10 days of continuous use, the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed into the Rhine, killing several American engineers still working on it. By then, 6 divisions were already across, and the bridge itself had become irrelevant to a war it had already decided. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, did not wait for permission to build on the accident. He fed division after division across that bridgehead, and then across pontoon crossings built beside it. And by the last week of March, 2 full American armies, the 1st under General Courtney Hodges and the 9th under General William Simpson, stood on German soil with the Ruhr directly in front of them. Before we go further into how that army got the Ruhr itself surrounded, a quick note. If this is the kind of story you come here for, the ones written in after-action reports and staff diaries instead of movie scripts, it genuinely helps to subscribe to the channel, Sam, WW2, so more of these forgotten battles keep getting made. Now back to the Ruhr. The Ruhr was not simply a region. It was the industrial lung of the Third Reich, the source of the coal and the steel that had built the tanks now dying in the snow of the Eastern Front. Around its cities, Essen and Dortmund and Bochum and Duisburg, sat the Krupp works and dozens of smaller plants that Berlin still believed could somehow keep the war machine breathing. Defending that ground was Army Group B, some 400,000 men on paper, built around the Fifth Panzer Army and the 15th Army, and commanded by a field marshal the German soldiers themselves had nicknamed, half in awe and half in dread, the Führer's fireman. His name was Walter Model, and for 3 years he had been sent to whichever front was collapsing fastest, ordered to hold ground that could not be held, and had somehow, again and again, held it anyway. Later in life, In a moment of rare tenderness recorded by an aide, he told a subordinate that his soldiers were his children. It was this same devotion, twisted by loyalty to a criminal regime, that would decide how this battle ended for him personally. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the overall German commander in the West by this point in the war, would later compare the experience of trying to fight these final battles to attempting a difficult piece of music on an instrument that was falling apart in his hands, out of tune and unreliable no matter how skilled the man playing it. It was as fitting a description of Army Group B's position that April as any German officer would offer. Facing model was not a single genius but a system. Bradley's plan borrowed the very tactic the German army had used to conquer half of Europe in 1940 and turned it back on its inventors. Instead of a slow, grinding frontal push into the Ruhr cities, the First Army would swing north from the Remagen bridgehead, while the Ninth Army swung south and east from its own crossings near Wesel, and the two American spearheads would meet somewhere behind the Ruhr, sealing every German soldier inside in a single stroke. It was a pincer built at army scale, coordinated across more than 100 kilometers of shattered German countryside, and it depended on a level of logistics, radio coordination, and armored mobility that the same American army had not remotely possessed when it landed in Normandy less than a year before. The German officers who had once called these men amateurs were about to be encircled by the very techniques their own military academies had written the textbooks on. This kind of encirclement was not new to the American army, and it had not always worked. 8 months earlier, in Normandy, a similar maneuver had gone wrong. At Falaise, a joint American, British, Canadian, and Polish effort trapped a large part of 2 German armies, only for a gap in the closing ring left open too long by hesitation and miscommunication between the converging forces to let tens of thousands of German soldiers escape east before the pocket finally sealed. Inside the Allied High Command, Falaise became shorthand for what encirclement looked like when it worked only halfway. The Ruhr was Falaise corrected. 2 American armies operating under a single unified command, closing a single ring with no seam left for anyone to slip through, and no ambiguity this time about who was responsible for making sure it held to the end. At dawn on the 1st of April 1945, Easter Sunday, patrols from the American 2nd Armored Division, driving north from the Ruhr's southern flank, made radio contact with patrols of the Ninth Army pushing south near the town of Lippstadt. When the 2 columns physically linked up later that day, the ring closed. Behind them, trapped in a pocket some 80 kilometers deep and 60 kilometers wide, sat the whole of Army Group B, along with hundreds of thousands of terrified civilians in cities already half destroyed by 4 years of Allied bombing. The soldiers who met that morning did not fully grasp what they had just done. They had in a single Easter Sunday maneuver sealed shut the largest single body of German troops still fighting in the West. What followed was not a clean surrender. It was 2 weeks of brutal, block-by-block, hill-by-hill fighting made stranger by the fact that both sides could sense the war's ending even as they killed each other over it. American infantry divisions, the 8th and the 97th among them, pushed into the pocket from multiple directions at once, supported by armor, artillery and fighter bombers that owned the sky completely. German resistance was wildly uneven. Veteran panzer crews, some of the last skilled tankmen the Reich possessed, fought with the discipline of soldiers who had survived years of war. Beside them, increasingly, stood boys of 15 and 16 from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm militia, handed rifles they barely knew how to load, and told to die for cities that were already lost. A German officer of the 15th Army, questioned after his capture, was recorded describing his own defense line as a museum of every age group the Reich had left to give, from grandfathers to children, with almost nothing in between. Inside the pocket, supply lines simply ceased to exist. Fuel for the panzers ran dry within days. Ammunition dumps bombed for months by Allied aircraft could not be resupplied because there was nowhere left to resupply them from. A tank crewman of the 116th Panzer Division, one of the most storied armored formations in the German army, later admitted that by the second week of the battle, his unit did not have a single working tank left, nor a single artillery shell to fire in its own defense. It is a strange kind of ending for a division that had fought from Normandy to the Reich's own doorstep. Not destroyed in one dramatic battle, but starved into irrelevance, one empty fuel can at a time. A flak battery commander, defending one of the pocket's last functioning rail yards, reported, in the days before his own capture, that his guns held perhaps 20 minutes of sustained ammunition against an American air presence that, by his own count, controlled the sky without interruption through every daylight hour. American commanders understood exactly what was happening inside the pocket because they had planned for it. Alongside the shells and the bombs came a different weapon entirely. Loudspeaker trucks parked at the edge of German positions, broadcasting in German, urging exhausted units to surrender rather than die for a war already lost. Leaflets fell by the tens of thousands, printed with safe conduct passes that German soldiers could hand to the nearest American unit. It was psychological warfare built on a simple, brutal truth. An army with no fuel, no food, and no hope does not need to be destroyed. It only needs to be given permission to stop. That permission arrived, in force, on the 14th of April. American troops of the 8th and 79th Infantry Divisions, advancing from opposite ends of the shrinking pocket, met near the city of Hagen and cut Army Group B cleanly in two. It was the single most important tactical moment of the entire campaign, because a divided pocket cannot coordinate its defense, cannot shift its remaining fuel and ammunition to wherever the threat is heaviest, and cannot maintain the illusion, even to its own soldiers, that rescue might still be coming. The 15th Army, cut off from its sister formation and from Model's own headquarters, capitulated that same day. It was the largest single collapse of the entire battle, and it broke something in the German command structure that never came back together. Walter Model now faced a decision that had nothing to do with tactics. Adolf Hitler had personally forbidden any withdrawal or surrender from the Ruhr. But Model had also sworn, as a Prussian officer of the old school, a personal oath he took seriously, even as the man he had sworn it to drag Germany into ruin. He could not bring himself to formally surrender his army group, an act his code of honor treated as an unforgivable betrayal. So, on the 15th of April, he chose a third path. He simply dissolved Army Group B as a fighting formation, discharged the youngest and oldest soldiers to walk home if they could, and left every remaining unit free to make its own decision about whether to keep fighting or lay down its weapons. It was surrender in every practical sense, dressed in just enough paperwork for Model to tell himself it was not. In private, to his chief of staff, he wondered aloud whether history would judge his choices kindly, and murmured that commanders of the ancient world, facing this kind of ruin, had simply taken poison. Once that order went out, the pocket did not fall. It flooded. On the 16th of April, the entire eastern half of what remained of Army Group B surrendered as one body. 2 days later, on the 18th, the western half followed. American riflemen moving forward that week described a war that had, in the space of 72 hours, turned almost silent, replaced by an endless tide of German soldiers walking toward them with hands raised or white cloth tied to their rifle barrels. Among the men accepting those surrenders near the town of Gummersbach was a young rifleman his squad called Tommy, a farm boy from Nebraska who had turned 20 that January and landed in France as a replacement in the autumn, filling a rifle slot left empty by a soldier he never met, killed in the hedgerows months earlier. He had spent the winter learning the war the hard way, in frozen foxholes east of the Rhine, watching friends rotate out wounded or worse. Now, in the second week of April, his war had turned into something closer to crowd control than combat, waving column after column of German soldiers toward a farm field, converted into a holding pen, checking identity discs, confiscating pistols and watches that soldiers on both sides collected as souvenirs, and counting prisoners until the number stopped meaning anything, entire companies simply materializing out of the tree lines with no officer left willing to give another order to fight. He wrote home that week that it did not feel like winning. It felt like the war finally running out of people willing to keep fighting it, on both sides at once. The scale caught even the Americans off guard. Intelligence officers had estimated, before the pocket closed, that perhaps 150,000 German soldiers might be trapped inside it. The true number, once every unit had either surrendered or scattered, came to 317,000 men, more than double what anyone had planned for. There were not enough prison camps built to hold them. Engineers improvised, fencing off open farmland along the Rhine with barbed wire and calling them, in the flat language of soldiers, meadow camps. Within days, those fields held human columns stretching further than the eye could follow, men who had marched across half of Europe now standing shoulder to shoulder in mud, waiting for a system that had never expected to process this many prisoners at once to figure out what to do with them. One German rifleman, handing his weapon to an American guard, was overheard asking a question that needed no translation to understand. "What's the point in this? I have a wife and children." That question echoed across the pocket in 1,000 smaller versions of the same crisis. Soldiers who had spent years being told that surrender was the one unforgivable failure a German soldier could commit now stood in open fields, weapons still in hand, working through arithmetic that had nothing to do with tactics, a wife in Cologne, a mother in Dortmund, orders from officers who still insisted the war was not over. Against an enemy standing 60 meters away with total control of the sky, working artillery, and no shortage of anything at all. For some men, that decision took hours of silent argument with themselves. For others, watching an entire company around them simply walk forward with hands raised, it took only the sight of the man beside them doing it first. It would be easy and wrong to tell this story as one where the Germans simply gave up without a fight. They did not. 10,000 American casualties were suffered taking the Ruhr, including roughly 1,500 killed outright, a heavy price for a battle popular memory has almost entirely forgotten. Whole German formations, especially fanatical units and remnants loyal to the last, fought to the edge of physical destruction rather than surrender, and in cities like Düsseldorf, where a small anti-Nazi resistance group tried to hand the city over peacefully to spare it further bombing, hardline elements crushed the attempt and executed the men involved. The Ruhr Pocket was not a bloodless formality. It was the last full-scale campaign the Western Allies fought against an organized German field army. And it was won the hard way, city by city, division by division, in 3 weeks that felt considerably longer to the men living through them. What makes the achievement remarkable is not simply the number of prisoners, striking as that figure is, it is what those numbers represented about the American army itself. The same force that had needed brutal, humiliating lessons at Kasserine Pass in North Africa to learn how to fight a modern mechanized war, that had been bogged down for months in the hedgerows of Normandy, relearning basic infantry tactics against a defending German army, had become, in under a year, capable of planning and executing a multi-army encirclement of a size and speed the Wehrmacht itself would have recognized as textbook blitzkrieg, and then finishing the job with a logistical and psychological campaign sophisticated enough to convince 317,000 enemy soldiers that further resistance was pointless. German staff officers who studied American operations later, from behind barbed wire, men trained in some of the most demanding military academies in the world, conceded in post-war interviews that the force they had once dismissed as soft and undisciplined had, by the war's final year, mastered combined arms warfare as completely as the army that had invented it. Walter Model did not live to see any of the historical reckoning that followed. On the 21st of April, 3 days after the last of his soldiers surrendered, he walked into a forest near Duisburg with 2 of his officers, handed them his personal effects, and shot himself, rather than face capture. He was the highest-ranking German field commander to take his own life in the entire war. 9 days later, in a bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler did the same. The 2 deaths were not unconnected. The destruction of Army Group B had removed the last coherent German military force capable of defending the Reich's industrial core, and within 3 weeks of Model's death, the war in Europe was over. And yet, ask almost anyone today to name the largest surrender of German forces on the Western Front, and you will hear about the Battle of the Bulge, or perhaps the fall of Aachen, or the beaches of Normandy that Hollywood has returned to again and again for 80 years. Almost nobody says the Ruhr. Part of the reason is timing. The battle unfolded in the final chaotic weeks of the European war, overshadowed within days by the fall of Berlin and the deaths of Hitler and Model themselves, and swallowed within a month by the far larger story of total German surrender on the 8th of May. Part of the reason is that it does not fit the story audiences expect. There was no single dramatic beach landing, no iconic photograph, no clean 3-act structure for a film studio to adapt. It was a triumph of planning, logistics and coordinated maneuver rather than singular heroism, and those stories, however decisive, rarely make it into popular memory the way a single desperate stand does. But the German officers who lived through it never forgot what they had witnessed. Not defeat by attrition, the slow grinding exhaustion the Wehrmacht itself had inflicted on so many enemies earlier in the war, but defeat by superior execution, an American army out-planning, out-supplying, and ultimately out-soldiering a Wehrmacht formation on ground the Germans themselves had chosen to defend. 317,000 men, 24 generals, 18 days. Somewhere along the Rhine in the spring of 1945, an American staff sergeant who had landed on Omaha Beach less than a year earlier watched an endless column of German prisoners walk past him into captivity and understood, without needing anyone to explain it to him, exactly how far his army had come.